Canada's proposed West Coast oil pipeline just moved from political talking point to a real test of power, because Enbridge is now signaling it may consider backing the project. If you live in the United States or Canada, this could affect fuel prices, energy jobs, trade leverage, and who controls North America's oil future. Washington has treated Canada's pipeline threat like a bluff, but the company now circling the project is not a slogan machine. It is one of the biggest energy movers on the continent. The proof is not in a speech. It is in who is willing to put money, steel, and permits behind the map. For months, the argument around a new Canadian oil pipeline to the Pacific coast sounded like another impossible Canadian debate. Alberta wanted a route to tidewater. Ottawa wanted climate conditions. British Columbia wanted the tanker ban protected. Indigenous nations wanted consultation that was real, not ceremonial. Oil producers wanted certainty before signing long shipping contracts. Environmental groups warned that Canada was drifting backward, and Washington, watching from the south, had every reason to believe the whole thing would collapse into the same old Canadian pipeline fight. Then came Calgary. On May 15th, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed an energy and carbon pricing agreement that did something Canada had not done in years. It put a target on the calendar. The agreement was tied to a proposed crude pipeline that could move 1 million barrels a day from Alberta to the northwest coast of British Columbia, with construction targeted to begin by September 2027 if legal duties, consultation, and other conditions are met. Reuters reported that the deal also raised Alberta's industrial carbon price path and connected federal support for the pipeline to carbon capture and emissions reduction conditions. That was the political move. But politics alone does not build a pipeline. Press conferences do not cross mountains. Memorandums do not weld pipe. Carbon deals do not move crude unless someone with balance sheet, engineering depth, regulatory experience, and market trust decides the project is worth touching. That is why Enbridge matters. Not because Greg Ebel announced a final investment decision. He did not. Not because Enbridge promised to build the line. It has not. Not because the project now has a confirmed route, a full list of shippers, a financing package, and every permit in hand. It does not. Enbridge matters because, before this, the biggest weakness in the West Coast pipeline argument was simple. Canada could talk about the project, Alberta could demand it, Ottawa could signal it, but critics could still ask one brutal question: who is actually going to build it? Now the answer is no longer empty. Enbridge CEO Greg Ebel said the company would consider backing a new oil pipeline to Canada's west coast after the Carney-Smith compromise. Energy Now, citing Bloomberg Television, reported that Ebel called the agreement a big step forward and described the changing landscape as a page flip, while still making clear that new infrastructure depends on how producers respond to the deal. That is not a victory parade, but it is a crack in the wall. And for Washington, that crack matters. Because the old leverage was built on one assumption: Canada had nowhere else to go. For decades, most Canadian crude has flowed south into the United States, feeding refineries in the Midwest and on the Gulf Coast. That made sense. The system was already built. The refineries were tuned for heavy crude. The pipelines were integrated. The relationship was profitable. But it also left Canada exposed. When one buyer has most of the exit doors, that buyer gets power. When one market can threaten tariffs, delay agreements, or squeeze terms, the seller has fewer options. The 6-year review of the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement is scheduled for July 1st, 2026. RBC's trade analysis says that meeting will not simply be a ceremonial check-in. It could become part of a rolling negotiation over tariffs, procurement, dispute rules, enforcement, and wider strategic demands. RBC also notes that the United States is positioning for a sustained negotiation model, while Canada wants to protect broad access to the U.S. market without giving up leverage on priority files. The White House can still pressure Canada. Washington can still use tariffs. American refiners still matter. U.S. demand still matters. The integrated energy market still matters. But the psychological advantage shifts when Ottawa can point to a credible private sector player and say, this is not just a press release. The companies that actually move energy are looking at it. That is why the Enbridge signal is so damaging to the idea that Canada's plan is just an oil bluff. Because Enbridge is not a minor operator with a political slogan and a glossy rendering. Enbridge says it moves about 30% of the crude oil produced in North America and transports nearly 20% of the natural gas consumed in the United States. It operates a massive cross-border liquids system, moves millions of barrels a day, and runs infrastructure that American consumers already depend on, whether they know its name or not. This is the part many viewers in the United States may miss. When Canadian leaders talk about energy leverage, they are not talking about some distant foreign supply that barely touches American life. They are talking about the fuel system underneath North America. Canadian oil is not an optional side note for many U.S. refineries. It is feedstock, it is margin, it is supply security. It is the reason some refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast can run the way they run. So if Canada begins building a larger path to Asia, Washington does not just lose a talking point. It risks losing the comfort of assuming that Canadian barrels will always have to come south first. But the story becomes even more important when you look at what Enbridge is already doing in British Columbia. Ottawa has approved Enbridge's $4 billion Canadian Sunrise expansion program on the West Coast natural gas system in BC. The federal government says the project will add up to 300 million cubic feet per day of natural gas transportation capacity, create about 2,500 jobs at peak construction, add more than $3 billion Canadian to Canada's GDP, and begin construction this summer. This situation is moving fast. By the time mainstream media covers the full picture, the moment to understand it will have passed. Subscribe so you are always ahead of the story, not catching up to it. Now look at the pressure on every player. Carney needs a pipeline path because his government is trying to do two hard things at once. It wants to show that Canada can still build major projects, and it wants to show that energy development can be tied to carbon pricing, carbon capture, and a cleaner industrial strategy. That is a narrow bridge. On one side, Alberta and the energy sector want fewer obstacles and faster approvals. On the other side, environmental groups, coastal communities, and many voters in British Columbia fear that Ottawa is weakening climate policy to get a pipeline through. Danielle Smith needs the pipeline because Alberta's entire argument is that Canada's energy wealth has been held back by federal rules, coastal restrictions, and years of political hesitation. For Alberta, 1 million barrels a day to the Pacific is not just an export project. It is a symbol of respect. It says the oil sands are not trapped. It says the province can reach global customers. It says Alberta is not simply a supplier that must accept whatever price and political mood the U.S. market offers. Enbridge needs certainty. That is the word hiding under everything. Certainty on the route, certainty on tanker access, certainty on shipper contracts, certainty on cost, certainty on federal and provincial alignment, certainty that Indigenous consultation will not be rushed and later overturned, certainty that the carbon capture requirements will be financeable, certainty that the project will not become another multi-billion-dollar lesson in Canadian regulatory risk. British Columbia needs something different. It needs proof that its coast, its communities, and its First Nations are not being treated as a corridor for a deal made in Calgary and Ottawa. The Federal Oil Tanker Moratorium Act prohibits large oil tankers carrying more than 12,500 metric tons of crude or persistent oil from stopping, loading, or unloading along BC's north coast. Transport Canada says the moratorium covers waters from the Alaska border down to the area near the northern tip of Vancouver Island, including Haida Gwaii. That ban is not a small legal footnote. It is one of the central walls in front of this project. Reuters has reported that BC Premier David Eby says his government would oppose any attempt to repeal the tanker ban off the province's northwest coast. A pipeline to northwest BC only makes commercial sense if the oil can move onto tankers and reach overseas customers. If the tanker ban stays untouched, the export logic weakens. If Ottawa tries to change the ban, the political fight in BC explodes. If Ottawa tries to carve out a narrow exception, the legal and Indigenous consultation questions become even more intense. So no, the pipeline is not real in the sense that shovels are in the ground and steel is ordered. But it is real in a different political sense. It is real enough that the federal government and Alberta have signed a framework around it. Real enough that Enbridge is now willing to consider it. Real enough that BC is already fighting the tanker question. Real enough that Indigenous consultation will decide whether this becomes a project or a courtroom battle. Real enough that Washington has to pay attention. That is the shift. Before, skeptics could laugh. Now they have to calculate. The commercial question comes next. A 1 million barrel a day pipeline is not built because politicians want a photograph. It is built because producers sign long-term contracts. Those contracts are the financial backbone. They tell lenders and investors that enough oil will flow for enough years to justify the risk. Without shipper commitments, the project is just a line on a map. With them, it becomes bankable. That is why Ebel's careful language matters. He did not say, "We are building it." He said the company would consider backing it, and he tied new infrastructure to how producers respond. That is the language of a CEO who sees the opening, but wants the market to prove demand before his company takes development risk. And development risk is not theoretical. Canada has lived this before. Northern Gateway, an Enbridge proposal from years ago, collapsed under legal, political, environmental, and indigenous opposition. Trans Mountain was so hard to finish that the federal government bought it to keep it alive. Keystone XL became a symbol of cross-border energy politics, and then died after years of changes in Washington. Every major pipeline debate in Canada carries the ghosts of projects that looked possible until they were not. So when Enbridge changes from hard no to maybe, that is important. But it does not erase the history. It means the door opened. It does not mean everyone has walked through it. For American viewers, the biggest question is what this does to U.S. energy power. The United States has benefited from Canadian dependence in quiet ways. U.S. refiners have had a secure, nearby, friendly supply of heavy crude. American buyers have often had the advantage because Canada had limited ways to reach global markets. When export options are narrow, price pressure grows. When the seller cannot easily walk away, the buyer negotiates from strength. A West Coast pipeline would not end that relationship. It would not cut America off. It would not make Canada independent from the U.S. energy market overnight. But it would create competition for Canadian barrels. Asian buyers could bid. Long-term contracts could shift. Canadian producers could compare U.S. offers with Pacific offers. And during tariff fights, trade reviews, or diplomatic disputes, Ottawa could speak with more confidence because it would no longer be trapped inside one export channel. That is why this is not just an energy story. It is a sovereignty story. Canada has spent years saying it wants to be less dependent on the United States without always building the infrastructure that makes independence credible. In trade, in defense, in technology, in critical minerals, and in energy, the same problem keeps appearing. Canada wants more options, but options cost money. Options require permits. Options require national consensus. Options require political pain before strategic benefit. The West Coast Pipeline is one of those options, and that is why Carney is taking a risk. He is telling Alberta that Ottawa will not simply block energy ambition. He is telling industry that carbon policy can be shaped into a deal instead of a wall. He is telling Washington that Canada can prepare an alternative route before the trade review. He is telling Asian markets that Canada may eventually offer more than promises. But he is also telling British Columbia, coastal First Nations, and climate voters that the federal government may be willing to reopen fights many thought were settled. That is the danger. The political win with Enbridge can become a political crisis in BC overnight. Because the tanker ban is not only about tankers, it is about trust. It is about whether coastal communities believe Ottawa will protect them when a national economic project demands sacrifice. It is about whether Indigenous nations are partners with veto-level moral power or stakeholders to be managed after the decision has already been made. It is about whether climate commitments survive when oil prices, tariffs, and geopolitical insecurity push governments back toward fossil fuel expansion. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Trump, bigger than Carney, bigger than Alberta. Energy security is back at the center of global politics. The war risk in the Middle East, sanctions against Russia, instability in shipping lanes, rising demand in Asia, and the desire of allies to buy from stable democracies have all changed the way governments think about oil and gas. For years, the elite conversation in many Western capitals assumed the energy transition would steadily reduce the strategic value of hydrocarbons. But the real world has been messier. Oil still moves armies, gas still heats homes, diesel still moves food, jet fuel still moves people. Petrochemicals still move through everyday life, and when supply gets threatened, voters do not ask for theory, they ask why prices are rising. That is why Alberta's argument has found new strength. Smith can say that Canadian oil is produced in a stable democracy, under rules, with labor standards, environmental monitoring, and a long-term alliance structure. She can argue that if the world is still using oil, buyers should prefer barrels from Canada over barrels from hostile or unstable regimes. That argument resonates with many energy security hawks in the US too. But the counter-argument is strong as well. Critics say building a new million-barrel-a-day oil export line locks in fossil fuel expansion at the exact moment Canada is supposed to cut emissions. They argue that carbon capture remains expensive, that oil sands emissions are still a serious problem, and that using climate policy to justify a pipeline could weaken Canada's credibility. They warn that tanker traffic on the North Coast creates spill risk in waters that are environmentally and culturally significant. Both sides are arguing from real stakes. That is why this fight will not be settled by one CEO interview. Still, the Enbridge signal has changed the balance. Before May 15th, the project had a political desire, but no obvious private champion. After May 15th, it has a giant watching the file closely. That does not guarantee construction, it does not guarantee financing, it does not guarantee legal success, but it does mean that the "nobody serious will touch this" argument is harder to make, and that is a problem for Trump's oil leverage. Because Trump's trade politics rely on pressure. Tariffs are not only taxes, they are messages. They tell the other side, you need our market more than we need your goods. They force companies to lobby their own governments. They create fear in supply chains. They turn dependence into negotiation power. Canada cannot answer that pressure with speeches. It can only answer with alternatives. More LNG access, more critical mineral processing, more interprovincial infrastructure, more export terminals, more energy routes to non-US customers, more buyers who can reduce the penalty of American pressure. The West Coast crude line is the loudest version of that answer. Do you think Canada should push this pipeline forward as a national leverage project, or is the environmental and indigenous risk too high? And for American viewers, should Washington use tariffs against a country whose energy system is already tied so deeply to yours? Those are not abstract questions. They are the questions that will shape North American power over the next year. Now look at Enbridge's financial position, because this is where the competitor angle needs discipline. It is tempting to say Carney has fully landed Enbridge. As a political headline, that lands. As a legal and financial fact, it is too strong. Enbridge has not committed capital to the crude pipeline. It has not announced a final investment decision. It has not filed a full route. It has not signed the shipper base. It has not said the tanker issue is solved. What Carney has landed is something narrower but still powerful. He has landed Enbridge's public willingness to re-enter the conversation. That is not nothing. Enbridge is valued by markets at roughly $126.7 billion based on current market data. And the company's own first quarter release reported 1.671 billion Canadian dollars in GAAP earnings attributable to common shareholders and 2.13 billion Canadian dollars in adjusted earnings. A company like that does not casually attach its name to fantasy infrastructure. It may study projects that never proceed. It may test the political weather. It may demand terms that governments cannot meet. But when it says it would consider backing a pipeline, investors, producers, governments, and foreign buyers listen. That is the commercial credibility the project lacked. The next test is whether oil producers will sign. The 5 largest oil sands producers have their own pressure. They want market access, but they also worry about the cost of carbon capture. Reuters reported that the new pipeline path is tied to industry investment in carbon capture, and that the Oil Sands Alliance has balked at the cost of building the project, while making clear it did not support the carbon tax changes in the Alberta deal. That is the contradiction inside the entire plan. The pipeline is being sold as an economic release valve for Alberta, but the federal condition is that the industry must move on carbon capture and accept a carbon price path. Alberta gets a possible route to Asia. Ottawa gets a climate framework it can defend. Industry gets the possibility of market access, but also new costs. Environmental critics see a weaker climate deal. BC sees tanker danger. Indigenous nations see another massive project moving toward their territories. Every party gets something. Every party gives something, and every party can still walk away. That is why the September 2027 construction target is both ambitious and fragile. It gives the project urgency, but it also exposes how much has to happen in a short window. The legal duty to consult Indigenous peoples has to be met. British Columbia's position has to be addressed. The tanker law has to be dealt with if the route depends on northern export access. Shippers have to sign. Carbon capture terms have to become real. Financing has to survive cost inflation. Courts have to stay out of the way, or at least not stop the clock. Any one of those can slow the project. Several together can kill it. So why is Washington still nervous? Because leverage does not wait until completion. Markets react to credible direction before steel goes into the ground. Diplomats react to credible options before contracts are finished. Negotiators react when the other side starts reducing dependence. If Canada can show by July 1st that it has a political agreement, a target date, a potential private sector giant, and a live national debate over export access, it has changed the atmosphere around the trade review. It has not built the pipeline, it has built a bargaining signal. And bargaining signals matter. When the US sits across from Canada in a CUSMA review shaped by tariffs and strategic pressure, Canadian officials can point to energy diversification as a long-term response. They can tell Washington that continued pressure will accelerate Canada's search for other buyers. They can tell provinces and industry that the cost of dependence has become too high. They can tell voters that national sovereignty requires infrastructure, not just slogans. That does not mean the US suddenly loses. America still has scale. It still has the world's largest economy. It still has deep capital markets, refineries, ports, defense power, and unmatched influence over North American trade. Canada cannot simply replace the US market with Asia. Geography is real. Pipelines are expensive. Tankers are contested. Asian buyers will demand price and reliability, and a future US administration could still change the pressure level again. But the moment Canada begins building alternatives, the relationship changes from dependency toward negotiation. That is the difference. Dependence says, please do not hurt us. Leverage says, if you hurt us, we will move. And the Carney-Smith-Enbridge triangle is the first time in this pipeline fight that the leverage line sounds less like fantasy and more like a plan with serious people around the table. For Canadian viewers, this is also a test of national unity. Alberta has long argued that Canada blocks the very industry that funds public services, supports jobs, and drives export income. British Columbia has long argued that Alberta and Ottawa cannot treat its coast as a shipping lane without local consent and environmental protection. Ottawa has long tried to balance climate promises with economic reality and often satisfied nobody. This deal puts all of that into one file. If Carney can move the pipeline forward while keeping consultation credible and climate conditions intact, he can claim Canada is capable of doing hard things again. If the deal collapses, Alberta will say Ottawa failed again. BC may say Ottawa should never have reopened the fight. Industry may say Canada remains unbuildable. Washington may say Canada's diversification threat was empty. Once a name like Enbridge enters the story, failure becomes louder. If Enbridge walks away later, opponents will say the project was never commercially viable. If shippers refuse long contracts, critics will say the market rejected it. If BC blocks tanker access, Alberta will say politics killed another export route. If Indigenous consultation exposes deep opposition, Ottawa will have to decide whether it is serious about consent or just serious about timelines. The next phase will be much harder than the announcement. That is why viewers should be careful with triumphal language. Trump's oil bluff may be cracking. It is not legally finished. It is not commercially finished. It is not physically finished. The pipeline is not built, and anyone pretending otherwise is selling certainty that does not exist. But the bluff is no longer safe. That is the correct read. The United States can no longer assume Canada has no builder. It can no longer assume Alberta and Ottawa cannot reach a deal. It can no longer assume CUSMA pressure will happen in a world where Canada has no alternative energy strategy. It can no longer assume the West Coast pipeline debate is dead. The project may fail, but it is alive enough to change behavior. Now consider the global layer. Asia wants reliable energy. Countries such as Japan, South Korea, India, and others have spent years looking for stable suppliers that do not carry the same geopolitical risk as Russia or the Middle East. China remains a massive energy buyer, though any deeper Canada-China energy link would come with its own political complications. Europe wants energy security too, but geography makes Pacific crude more naturally tied to Asian demand. If Canada can reach Pacific tidewater at larger scale, it becomes more than America's northern supplier. It becomes a more flexible energy exporter in a world where supply reliability has become a strategic asset. This is why infrastructure is power. Not speeches, not slogans, not flags behind podiums. Pipes, ports, contracts, permits, tankers, courts, indigenous agreements, financing, labor, steel. That is where national strategy becomes real. And that is where Canada has often struggled. The country has enormous resources, but it has also built a reputation for delay. Investors see court challenges, provincial conflict, changing rules, cost overruns, and political reversals. Supporters of the pipeline argue that Carney's deal is an attempt to reverse that reputation. Opponents argue that speed cannot come at the cost of climate promises, coastal protection, or Indigenous rights. Both are watching Enbridge, because Enbridge is the test of whether the middle path exists. Can a private company believe the rules are stable enough? Can Ottawa make the tanker question politically survivable? Can Alberta accept carbon conditions without turning on the deal? Can BC be brought into any framework without feeling overrun? Can Indigenous nations shape the route and benefits in a way that is more than symbolic? Can producers sign contracts large enough to pay for the line? And can all of this happen before the target date becomes another missed Canadian deadline? Most people following this story are getting the surface version. Subscribe here for the full picture, what it means, why it matters, and what is coming next. Do not settle for half the story. So here's the bottom line. Carney has not delivered a finished West Coast pipeline. What he has done is more subtle and, in some ways, more dangerous for Washington. He has taken a project that critics could dismiss as political theater and moved it closer to commercial reality by creating a carbon pricing compromise with Alberta and drawing conditional interest from a company large enough to matter. Enbridge has not promised to build, but Enbridge has made it harder to say nobody credible will. That is why Trump's oil bluff is no longer the same bluff it was before May 15th. The pressure strategy depends on Canada having no serious exit, and now Canada is trying to build one in public, on a deadline, with CUSMA review pressure closing in. The question now is not only whether Canada can beat Washington's leverage, the question is whether Canada can survive its own internal fight long enough to make that leverage real. In my next video, I'm covering how British Columbia and coastal First Nations could become the real power brokers in this pipeline battle, and what I found will change how you see this.